Okay, economic inequality. Economic inequality is kind of really the issue of our times. I mean, there's a lot of single issues, but many of those single issues all come under the big tent of economic inequality. So there's poverty, there's the family, there's education, there's discrimination, there's, all sorts of job issues. There's all sorts of issues, but now in the modern context, they've all come under this big tent of economic inequality. The last couple of generations it's been sort of baked into their consciousness that economic inequality is the most important issue facing humanity. The other side of that coin, Thornton's side of that coin, is that really the case? Or is it really just kind of like a communist plot? As I see it, it's selected scholars, politicians, journalists, even Pope Francis, and the entire educational system in the West that has built in this sort of quasi-general communist ideology into our brains to be very, very suspicious of capitalists and entrepreneurs and always being really worried and concerned about the worker and relying on the politician. That's not, strictly speaking, dogma coming out of Karl Marx's Capitalism and the Communist Manifesto, but it's that sort of general background. And that's what I'm basically going to be here to debunk and to present the Austrian vision, which is really completely counter to that general vision that we have been experiencing. You've already seen and you've already learned bits and pieces of the Austrian perspective. Specifically in my class on the minimum wage law, we learned that in a free market, that the wages of labor are determined by the discounted marginal revenue product of labor. So there's a scientific explanation for wage rates, and competition drives and controls that wage rate. It's not employers don't get to decide, workers don't get to decide, markets decide and regulate that whole process. You've also been exposed to the other categories of the other factors of production and their incomes. So you've learned that interest is very, very important. It's what capitalists earn from their efforts and what they do. They have a different time preference than the rest of us. They save money, they invest money in the economy, and that's really the primary ingredient to the productivity of labor, because they provide labor with all the great tools and facilities that makes them productive and drives up the wage rate. You've learned that the entrepreneur earns profits, and the inherent difficulties that the entrepreneur faces, even in a free market economy, more or less the interventionist economy that we have today, and that the entrepreneur does a lot of great things. Specifically, the entrepreneur is the uncertainty bearer. And, most people don't like the idea of having to bear that uncertainty and having to manage the whole process. So you're making the decisions. A lot of people are averse to that, and they don't want to be in charge. They don't want to manage things. And that's what the entrepreneur they take that burden, and then they end up paying labor for their effort before the product is even sold. So each of these groups or categories in the economy, they play productive functional roles in the economy, and they're compensated. And in the free market, competition drives those compensations to sort of fair, equal levels. We've also learned about the role that government intervention plays here in income or economic inequality. I talked about the implications of that for the minimum wage, and you've also seen lectures that have touched on the Austrian business cycle theory and what that does to the economy in terms of distorting incomes in the economy. So you've already learned bits and pieces. And then, of course, we had the great lecture by Professor Wanjiro Nagoya about race and discrimination, which really is a key ingredient in that communist plot. That, you know, it's the evildoer employers and entrepreneurs and capitalists that are taking advantage of people, whether it's minorities in specific cases or just taking advantage of labor in other cases. And then I want to, at the end, bust the general myth, really, that that the U.S. is the world's worst offender in all of these areas. That in the U.S., the income or economic inequality is greater than it is anywhere else in the world, and that in the U.S. that the government is held hostage and fails to tax these evil entrepreneurs and capitalists, and as a result, they're very, very stingy in terms of giving out benefits to the poor and the needy and the homeless and blah, 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 blah. That is a big myth, that the U.S. is somehow the worst offender, and that all of these enlightened socialist economies in Europe and Canada are much more forward-thinking and do a much better job and really are in touch with economic inequality. So Austrians love, or at least appreciate, economic inequality. What's it based on? What does it do for us? Instead of being the bane of human existence, it's actually a great strength, and it's just basically part of reality. Austrians recognize that individual humans are unique individuals. We're all different in many, many different ways. Tom Woods in the first lecture, pointed out that economics gets attacked for viewing us all as just little cogs in the machine, that, we're homo economicus, we're just little robots, we're all the same, we're interchangeable, blah, blah, blah. Austrians have a completely different perspective on human beings, that we're all individuals, that we're all unique, that we all have all sorts of differences, and exploiting those differences, you exploiting your talents, your interests, your abilities, and and knowing your deficiencies or building up your deficiencies is what makes you a productive contributing member and earns you a lot of income. So we love economic inequality. There are many types of equality and inequality, and many great thinkers and writers down through history have pointed out that totalitarians have used not just politics, but they've used language as a way of exploiting us, of gaining control over our lives, and then the politicians exploiting us. I think probably Orwell is a good example concerning that. And then, of course, socialists use coercion to solve our problems, in this case, solving the problem of economic inequality. The original socialists said that they could fix capitalism, they could make capitalism more efficient. That didn't work out, so they've switched gears to the new problems that in the post-communist world are economic inequality and the environment. Okay, and that's basically will start to reveal the distortions in that record. Ludwig von Mises in Human Action wrote, "Even those who look upon the inequality of wealth and incomes as a deplorable thing cannot deny that it makes for progressing capital accumulation, and is additional capital accumulation alone that brings about technological improvement, rising wage rates, and a higher standard of living." In other words, when we put that first, when we put capital accumulation first, it's something that rises up the entire economy and the entire human civilization, because we have more savings and then more capital, better tools, better facilities, better technology. Technology doesn't occur in a vacuum. It, of course, requires lots of capital. And you can look at what Mises said about a lot of different things in a book I edited called The Quotable Mises. There's several quotations of Mises on inequality, but also on things like fate and luck. So if you have any questions or concerns, this is a good place to get a taste of the real Ludwig von Mises. And it's not just a coffee table book. It's actually a good place to get started answering questions, whether that's a personal question or a little debate you're having, or you're doing research. If you want to know what Mises had to say about something, it's probably going to be in this book. And of course, the quotes are referenced for the books they come from, the page numbers, so you can go immediately with all of our free PDFs and find out the details on that particular subject matter. Now, taking a look at this issue of egalitarianism, the philosophy that thinks we should all be equal along many different vectors of human life, Murray Rothbard brings a libertarian, but also an economic and a very realistic perspective to this issue, in the anti-egalitarian perspective. He wrote that if men were like ants, there would be no interest in human freedom. If individual men, like ants, were uniform, interchangeable, and devoid of specific personality traits of their own, then who would care whether they were free or not? Who indeed would care if they lived or died? The glory of the human race is the uniqueness of each individual, the fact that every person, though similar in many ways to others, possesses a completely individuated personality of his own. It is the fact of each person's uniqueness, the fact that no two people can be wholly interchangeable, that makes each and every man irreplaceable, and that makes us care whether he lives or dies, whether he is happy or oppressed. And finally, it is the fact that these unique personalities need freedom for their full development that constitutes one of the major arguments for a free society. So again, that critique that Tom Woods brought to our attention in the first lecture about economics treating humans as robots is completely untrue in the Austrian framework. Okay, in order to defeat the egalitarian call for economic equality, it's very important to know the different types of income classes, their different types of income and where they earn that income. And in this framework, also note that these are categories and that individuals will actually be acting across some of these categories. So the most basic and most familiar category is labor. That's where we work, usually at an hourly wage, and we earn income from working. And the hourly wage is based on the marginal productivity of labor, which is based on the amount of capital accumulation. I use the term landlords here. It's the old-fashioned term from classical economics when they were talking about the people who owned the farmland and then later the people who rented out apartments and houses in the city. But this really applies to all property and resource owners. So land certainly is one of them. Buildings and structures is certainly a resource, but also things like minerals and oil and natural gas that are deep underneath the land. This class of owner earns rents, and that those rents are based on their ownership and their stewardship of those resources. Again, a very important neglected class in the economy, but these are the people who are responsible for resources that in some cases are depletable. Okay, so there's a certain amount of a particular mineral, let's say, copper, in the world. It's relatively scarce. It's very important. Maybe our generation will just become copper hogs and want to use up all the copper that's in the earth. Well, one of the things that the resource owner does is it looks at the price of the product now versus the price of the product in the future over a long period of time, and says, I may not want to dig up all my copper right now. I may want to wait and exploit that resource in the future. Capitalists are the savers in the economy. They accumulate savings, they invest in capital, and they earn interest. And this all comes about, as you learned, from individual differences in time preferences. People with high time preferences want to consume everything right now, and people with low time preferences are going to be saving for the future. And their sacrifice is actually what gives us better houses, better office buildings, better factories, better tools, better machinery, makes us more productive, and ends up giving us higher levels of productivity and wages. And then, of course, there's the entrepreneur. An individual business owner can be working in all of those categories simultaneously. So they can be investing the money that they've saved, maybe others have saved, in resources, and they're actively spending time managing those resources, the labor, maybe cleaning the bathrooms, whatever, and may actually, their income that gets reported to the IRS may actually really have bits and pieces of all of those contributions. And I mentioned this at the beginning, but income redistribution comes in many forms, but the important forms include plunder, which is incomes that are taken from individuals in the form of taxation usually, and this redistributes income from the productive classes to the political and non-productive classes. So the people producing goods and services for consumers, they lose income. And people who don't contribute anything, the politicians, the crony capitalists in some cases, welfare recipients and so on, the non-contributors, they end up benefiting. So that's a redistribution from the productive to the non-productive. And then there's the whole issue of privilege. And you've seen bits and pieces of this in a lot of the lectures so far this week. When the government intervenes, it intervenes in such a way to create winners and losers. And so winners and losers in each of those individual cases means a redistribution of income. So the government, for example, creates artificial rights in the economy to select individuals, or it creates opportunities for individuals to earn these artificial rights, which are also called monopoly privileges. And now they're called, we call them monopoly privileges. Doctors, call it the license to practice medicine. And so there's a lot of professions where the government requires not just, the ability to conduct yourself in a profession, but it adds in other things that protects people in those industries from competition and allows them to drive up their wages. And of course, driving up their wages and driving competitors out of that profession means that some people who would prefer to be in that profession, like say some people could be doctors, but because of the licensing requirement, they're not allowed into that profession, so they've got to go to some other profession, some lower income profession, where they've got to compete in larger numbers within that group. So the people with the licenses, they get an advantage. The people without the licenses have a disadvantage, which spills over into non-monopolized professions or competitive professions. And of course, the consumer's hurt as well. So there's lots of winners and losers. With both plunder and privilege, you get decreased production in society. So it's not a zero-sum game here. We get a net decrease in overall production and a net decrease in the standard of living. So everything is pulled downward. The only general gain here is that the state gains power or authority over the individual. So I've already gone through the fact that we looked at a lot of different aspects about why we are so unequal, that we all have, advantages and disadvantages. We all have all kinds of physical, biological differences in tastes and preferences. In the differences in tastes really boil down to everything. What we like to do, what professions we'd like to work in. Do we want to work inside or outside? Do we want to work part-time or full-time or on our own time? These are all individuated tastes. And basically, another concept that we've covered so far this week is the law of comparative advantage. That if we are allowed to and produce at those things which we have a very low opportunity cost, and then end up trading with one another, that we'll all have more to consume. We'll be producing more, and we'll be consuming more. And as that law of comparative advantage influences the local, regional, national, and international markets, our comparative advantages may change, but we end up being able to produce in a more refined way what we're really good at. And as a result, overall production rises and the standard of living rises. The great thing about comparative advantage is that we all have one, and you're not stuck with it either. I mean, just because I'm a dishwasher at a certain stage of my life doesn't mean I'm going to be a dishwasher for the rest of my life. I may, develop myself, I may gain experience, I may move up within the organization, I may get some training and take on an entirely new and different job. I may go to college part-time and be able to qualify to get an entry-level position in some other profession. So we all have a comparative advantage, but we're not stuck with it. We can develop and move forward. As part of that language issue, there are a lot of dubious types of equality in the markets. Most of them are obviously wrong and at odds with reality. And all of the attempts to establish equality of result, like we may all be different, but we should have all the same income, or we may have lots of differences, but we should end up with the same amount of wealth. All of those types of proposals and schemes to create equality of results have been failing since we've tried to do those things, and that those attempts go back prior to the Roman Empire, and they all come undone, they all fail, and they can end up harming society. There are a lot of the concept of equality and inequality and different types of human systems. I list natural law, and the rule of law is offering some forms of equality and justice, but all of the political systems, from theocracy to socialism and so forth, are really caste-like systems and are basically systematic forms of injustice. If I recognize and respect other people's property rights, if we all recognize and respect other people's property rights, that's a kind of ideology of equality that makes sense, particularly to libertarians, that we all have in common that basic belief that we should recognize and respect everybody's property rights equally across the board. So that's really the only sense, and that's related to natural law and the rule of law systems. Now, starting from that initial state of comparative advantage, human development requires basically freedom and the absence of any kind of despotism or caste system. And the process of human development based on freedom recognizes the fact that for eons, humans lived at bare subsistence. But when we first started to understand, developed, and accept freedom, individual freedom, that we moved beyond subsistence. And this basically first came to a flowering during the Industrial Revolution, where the division and specialization of labor based on comparative advantage started to take place and increased productivity. The increase in productivity increased wages beyond subsistence. Really, for the first time, did we have a movement of wages beyond subsistence that was stable or sustainable in the long run. There were, prior to the Industrial Revolution, there were some experiences with wages above subsistence, but they were not sustainable. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. And so there we have basically the genesis of the process of human development. And what we know is that every role within this system, in a competitive system, in the market system, is very often harder than it might appear. It's harder than it looks. It's an amazing system when we sit back in the classroom and talk about it, but we should all understand that it's a lot more difficult on everybody than in a chalkboard type of explanation. So we get amazing results in terms of the standard of living, in terms of a tremendous increase in population, of life expectancy, and even equality of results that we were able to and we can achieve. First of all, capitalist families had to deprive themselves in order to save and to acquire capital. Most people consume all or most of what they produce. So these capitalistic families were special. Their after risk return of repayment, that was always at risk, and the return was always relatively low. Given the existence of bankruptcy of creditors, market fluctuations, inflation and taxes, which were a part of the system from a very early time. Entrepreneurs bear uncertainty with the prospects in the marketplace for profits. We do see extreme success stories, but we see extreme success stories in every profession. Guitar players, singers, actresses, ball players, boxers, entrepreneurs, every profession has its all-stars. But behind the fame and fortune is a lot of difficulties, is a lot of failures. Most entrepreneurs fail even if they produce a pretty good product, even if they treat their labor pretty good. Okay, one of my favorite pizzas of all time in my hometown, I thought, finally, we've got some good pizza. And then the guy went out of business. So just having the best product, it turns out he couldn't afford to make that great pizza and sell enough of them to cover his cost, which is what the entrepreneur has to do. So a lot of entrepreneurs lose all of their investments. Again, in review, incomes in the free market, labor, landlord, capitalist, and entrepreneur, we've covered that in what they're providing and what they're getting, but just to extend that review a little bit, it's important to know that labor gets its money right up front. Okay, so you work a week and you get paid at the end of the week. If you work a shift at the restaurant, most of your income goes home that night with you in cash. The landlord gets their money at the end of the month. Or if they own oil wells, they may get their money a couple of months later after they've provided the good. So they get paid maybe a little bit now, but they get paid over time. The capitalist also has to wait. So the capitalist has to wait while their money is essentially being used. They get paid interest after it's earned. And then the entrepreneur not only gets paid after the fact, the entrepreneur has to make sure the labor gets paid, the resource owners get paid, the capitalist or the bank gets paid, and only then, after everybody else is paid, does the entrepreneur maybe take home a paycheck, maybe earn profits, but could also earn losses. Now, so that's really the Austrian view of all of this. Income distribution. Income occurs basically in the process of production. Now, as I mentioned, Karl Marx and the Socialist proposed that socialism would be more efficient, would be more productive than the anarchy of the marketplace. The socialist, and many people today see the marketplace as, it's just chaotic. It doesn't make any sense. It's not well engineered, that things don't make sense. It seems like there's duplication of effort and so on. And so the socialists thought they could outdo capitalism. Mises showed why that was not going to be the case, that at best, socialism was inefficient. After the downfall of communism, the socialists, such as Robert Heilbrunner, admitted Mises was right. And Heilbrunner and many others, including Thomas Piketty, said, well, we're going to change our whole strategy. Socialism may not be more productive, but it's better at achieving equity or equality, and it's better for ecology or ecological reasons, better for the environment. And so they've switched stories to providing equality through welfare and progressive income taxes and environmental protection against global warming and against climate change. Of course, the main goal is more power over the individual. I'm going to skip that and move right on to this final myth of inequality in America. And I would recommend this book, The Myth of American Inequality, by Phil Graham, Robert Eklund, and John Early. It addresses all of the issues associated with income inequality and wealth inequality, mobility, poverty, work effort, productivity, everything under the sun that's related to this topic. If you're in economics or you need to write a paper on this subject, or you're going to graduate school on this in economics or related disciplines, this book takes you through all of the economics and statistics of this issue and does so very effectively, I think, and shows a much truer picture of inequality in America. And it basically looks at the period between the mid-1960s and the present. The mid-1960s is when the war on poverty started, when welfare started on a very large scale in the United States. And it re-examines all of the statistics over that time period. And it finds that government statistics that you have been exposed to, that have been a part of all those memes and articles and graphs that you've seen, they're all fundamentally wrong because they don't count all of the amount of welfare dollars that is given away in the United States. In fact, it doesn't even account for the majority of welfare dollars given away in the United States. It doesn't account for all of the tax dollars taken from American income earners. It doesn't. It does account for more than half of all taxes taken, but it misses huge swaths of tax dollars taken from American income earners. As a result, it presents a completely biased picture and gives you all of those results about how America is very unequal in terms of economic results, that we're stingy in terms of giving away benefits to welfare recipients, people on poverty programs. The number of poverty programs in the United States at the federal level is over 100 different programs. And then there's a lot of state-specific programs as well. I'd never even heard of most of them, but there's significant tax dollars involved. So that's a very important book. And I want to give you a couple of the general points here from the book. And this is income distribution over this period. The book was published in 2022, but this refers to the entire period. And the dashed line, starting down here, and then moving up, is the actual income of the top 20% of income earners, the next lower 20% of income earners, and then down here is the lowest 20% of income earners. This is how much money they ultimately received from income plus welfare programs. So you can see that people down here in the bottom are either not working at all or working very little. The people in the lowest quintile, the bottom 20%, worked on average 2.4 hours a week. So there's very little work effort, and a lot of that is because if they don't work, they qualify for a lot more welfare programs. So they're earning a few $1,000s here, but they're taking home a total of $50,000 per household in total benefits. And that's way higher than almost all of the European economies. On the taxation side, this dashed line represents incomes. So indeed, the top quintile earns a lot of income, but the dashed red line is all the taxes they pay. So the wealthy, the high income groups in the United States pay way more in taxes than any of its OECD or European counterparts. The United States soaks the rich more than any country in the world. So that's just not, that whole idea that the US is somehow the least egalitarian country is not true. And then finally, it's also important to note, as a taste of what you'll find in the book, is This is the US poverty rate from World War II to the present. And after World War II, the poverty rate in the United States fell precipitously and only leveled out once the welfare programs went into effect. They were projected, if there were no welfare programs, poverty would be about 2.5% to 3%. And I'm going to borrow a minute of your time because it's important to understand the equality depopulation connection. Depopulating an economy does drive up wages and does create equality. The Black Death in Europe created a lot of equality in Europe. The early part of the 20th century created a lot of equality in the United States after World War II, because millions of people were killed in World War I from the Spanish flu, from the Great Depression, and from World War II. It literally wiped out a huge percentage of young people who were coming into their family formation years. And so family formation and population in the United States and many other countries fell precipitously. And as a result, after World War II, labor was relatively scarce compared to capital in the United States, and it created some more income inequality. But that's really not a great way to achieve equality. You know, in other words, if we blew up a bunch of nuclear weapons around the world and killed off a lot of people, we'd get more income inequality. But that's really not, you know, it just seems to me, I may be wrong, but just thinking about reality, I don't think that's really a good idea. Thank you very much.